In contrast, the art that becomes popular in the mid to late 18th century is art that reflects the new and changing values of that century. One of the major philosophical movements of the 18th century is called the art of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a series of philosophical thoughts or philosophical movements. And you've probably heard of philosophers associated with this movement. People like John Locke are part of this movement, but also scientists. People like Isaac Newton are often considered part of the Enlightenment. Webster, writing the first dictionary. In France, Denis Diderot is writing the first encyclopedia. So part of the drive of the Enlightenment, and where we get this name, is a desire to understand and to know about everything in the world. In art, this is reflected in a much more serious and simple style than the Rococo. This particular painting is our first American painting, and in it we see a portrait of Paul Revere. This is a portrait of Paul Revere before he becomes the famous American founding father that we all remember today. In this portrait, he's actually just a simple tradesman, a simple silversmith from Boston. But the style of this painting is simple, it's direct. We see Revere in clean clothes, but plain clothes, surrounded by the tools of his trade, lost in seeming contemplation of what to engrave on the silver teapot. This portrait is actually something of a mystery to art historians. The expense for this type of portrait would have been extremely high for somebody like Paul Revere, somebody who was a tradesman, and we're not really sure why he chose to have these portraits of himself and his wife painted. But the clean, simple, direct style that we see in this painting reflects what we often think of as the art of the Enlightenment. Other Enlightenment painters show us the scientific parts of the movement more directly. So the work of Joseph Wright of Derby is from England, and Joseph Wright is primarily a painter who works for those new industrialists, that new class of people that I mentioned in talking about Hogarth's work. And industrialists were particularly prominent in England. After 1850, we see the invention of the steam engine, and we start to see the beginning of many industrial processes, and people are becoming wealthy in ways that they weren't able to before. And these new wealthy industrial magnates often wanted to imitate the lifestyles of the aristocracy, but they don't have necessarily the hereditary wealth or hereditary estates complete with fine art to do so. So they turn to people like Joseph Wright to make pictures that reflect their interests. So what we see in this particular picture is a philosopher giving a lecture at an orrery. The word philosopher in the title here is a more generic term. So in the same way today we can talk about somebody getting their PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy, in many different subjects. The philosopher here is somebody we would probably consider more like a scientist today, and he's the man in the center in the red gown. The orrery that he's standing in front of is a model of the solar system, so we can see the lamps in the center that act as the sun, and the different metal bands that imitate the orbits of the different planets or celestial bodies within the solar system. And if we look around this picture, this really reflects a broad interest in science in the mid to late 18th century, that the audience is quite varied. There are several children here, and they seem to be probably a little bit more interested in this contraption than they really are in the scientific principles. But there are several people of all ages, and both men and women, who are actually quite interested in this lecture, and quite interested in these new scientific principles. We can see that, like Copley's portrait of Paul Revere, the background is quite plain and simple here. We see some books on the shelf and a curtain on the right-hand side, but just a plain wall behind the philosopher. And the focus is really much more on the composition and the narrative of what's happening than the kind of dramatic exuberance that we see in the Rococo. The drama in this painting does come from the contrast of dark and light, and Wright does take inspiration from 17th century figures like Caravaggio in the strong contrast of dark and light.